Hey everyone! Tonight we travel back more than 1,000 years to a world without GPS or even reliable maps. Picture yourself standing on a gray northern shore, breath misting in the cold air, listening to the endless whisper of the North Atlantic. Somewhere nearby, waves crash against stone, and the smell of salt and tar mixes with smoke drifting from a longhouse. You can almost hear the groan of a longship being dragged toward the tide. It's dark, cold, and wet. And yet, the people who lived here understood this ocean better than most of us ever will. They didn't just sail it. They listened to it, read it, even smelled it. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a single crossing in their world. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I make here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Find somewhere quiet. You move closer to the waterline, boots pressing into the wet sand, and feel that strange pulse of awareness that Viking sailors once called half-full, the sea sense. It wasn't pure superstition, at least not entirely. It was a body-learned instinct, sharpened through repetition, hardship, and survival. Every ripple on the surface, every breath of wind through the rigging carried information. A message, if you knew how to read it. Imagine being one of them. No compass, no charts, no weather forecast. Just a wooden hull, a cloth sail, and a horizon that could swallow you whole. And yet these sailors reached Iceland, Greenland, even the coast of North America, centuries before Columbus ever thought about a compass rose. Historians still debate whether Leif Erikson truly landed at Lance aux Meadows by intention or accident. But either way, the navigation that brought him there is remarkable. The widely accepted fact is straightforward. The Vikings were skilled sailors who crossed open seas with a precision far beyond what their era should have allowed. But the more fascinating truth is that they achieved this by combining sharp observation with an almost intimate connection to the natural world. They didn't separate science from story. The sea was alive to them, a vast, intelligent presence that could be understood through signs. A ring around the moon meant incoming storms. The sound of distant breaking waves could mean hidden land ahead. You walk along the surf line, cold water brushing your ankles. Every wave feels rhythmic, steady, and ancient. Picture yourself now aboard a nar, a sturdy cargo ship built for endurance. You sway with the swell, hearing the crew speak in Old Norse, their rough voices blending with the cries of seabirds. At the stern, a helmsman grips the tiller, feeling the ship's vibration pass through the timber like a heartbeat. That's how they sense direction, through touch, through resonance. As night settles in, stars appear one by one. No sextant, no telescope, just bare eyes trained by generations of storytelling. Constellations were passed down through sagas and songs. The North Star wasn't a coordinate, it was a companion. When you see it holding steady above the mast, you begin to understand why its consistency offered comfort on those long, uncertain voyages. Some believed it was the eye of Odin, watching over their journeys. Others, more practically minded, used it simply to find true north. But long before stars guided them, sound did. Listen now, beyond the slap of water on the hull, beyond the creak of oars. Viking sailors could estimate their distance from shore by listening to how waves echoed off cliffs, a technique later confirmed by modern acoustic science. In thick fog, they would strike the water with oars, or even hum low notes, and interpret how the sound returned. Sharp echoes meant rocks were close. Dull, muffled returns meant open water. It's striking, isn't it? Modern sonar operates on the exact same principle, though nobody sings to the sea anymore. You look toward the horizon. It's nearly impossible to tell where sky ends and water begins. That's the reality they faced on every voyage, every storm. But rather than anxiety, there was method. Each person aboard contributed to reading that environment. The oarsman noticed when the water's drag shifted with changing currents. The steersman tracked how clouds moved overhead. The cook sniffed the air for signs of rain or nearby fish. These weren't treated as separate skills. Together they formed one collective awareness of place and direction. At times, that awareness crossed into something harder to explain. There are accounts, part oral tradition, part navigational record, of sailors claiming to sense land before they could see it. Some described a faint tingling sensation when freshwater rivers discharged into the sea nearby. Historians question whether that's folklore or an early awareness of subtle changes in water salinity, detectable through taste and skin contact. Modern researchers acknowledge that the human body can register small chemical differences in air and moisture, though most of us have long since lost the sensitivity to notice them. A cold gust moves across your face, carrying the scent of kelp and wet wood. In this world, every small detail carried meaning. The Vikings didn't battle the sea, they worked with it. Their ships were built to flex with waves rather than fight them, using overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets. The sound those rivets made under stress told an experienced captain how much strain the hull was absorbing. That's not poetic language. That's practical knowledge expressed through years of experience. Close your eyes for a moment and feel the wind shifting around you. Tonight the sea doesn't roar, it hums, steady and low. The same hum those sailors fell asleep to, trusting it to carry them safely through the dark. You begin to understand why they treated it with such deep respect, not as something to fear, but as an unpredictable force worthy of careful attention. The line between knowledge and instinct starts to blur. And in that space, you catch a glimpse of what learning once looked like, not written in books, but embedded in the body. A sailor didn't simply know the route to Iceland. In a real sense, he was the route. His muscle memory traced invisible paths across currents and stars. Perhaps that's what we've slowly lost. Not just the specific techniques, but the feeling of being truly connected to something enormous and alive. You stand still as the tide pushes higher. The horizon glows faintly under moonlight, every ripple catching silver. Somewhere behind you, a horn sounds, the signal to depart. You're ready. You've heard what the salt and the night have been saying. The voyage begins. You're on deck now. The planks are damp under your boots, the air tense with quiet focus. The sea spreads out like dark glass. And you understand that everything here depends on paying attention, not just hearing what's around you, but truly listening to it. Viking sailors mastered this long before instruments or navigation tools existed. They called it sjóvar, a deep intuition built through years of exposure, patience, and the particular kind of stillness that settles over you when there's nothing but open water in every direction. The first thing you notice is the absence of sound. When the sea goes quiet, it isn't calm, it's a signal. Every experienced sailor understood that. A sudden hush often meant fog was approaching, or that a storm was forming somewhere beyond the visible horizon. You can feel that pressure now, as though the air itself has paused. The Vikings didn't react with alarm when silence came. They leaned into it, tilted their heads, and waited. They could identify the shape of a coastline by how waves echoed off it. A sharp slap meant cliffs. A hollow thud meant a sandy beach. A soft whisper meant marshes. They learned to test their surroundings with sound, sometimes humming, sometimes tapping the hull with a wooden peg, and the returning echo served as their map. Historians still debate whether this was a conscious form of early sonar or simply an instinct refined over generations. Either way, it was effective. Records from Icelandic sagas describe sailors locating fjord entrances in complete fog by listening carefully to how waves bounced back from the terrain ahead. You crouch near the side of the ship and let your fingers drag through the water. It's colder than expected, sharp, almost metallic. The sound around you is layered, lapping waves, distant gulls, the low groan of the hull beneath you. Each layer carries its own information. A Viking could detect nearby icebergs by the way waves fractured around them. He could sense a river mouth approaching by the dulling of the swell. It's worth pausing on how much of that knowledge has faded. Today we stare at digital displays rather than the waterline, waiting for algorithms to flag what our ancestors perceived through direct experience. Then the fog moves in. It isn't white, it's gray and heavy, pressing in on all sides. The ship feels smaller inside it, sounds muffled by mist. The helmsman leans closer to the water, one hand firm on the rudder, the other cupped near his ear. You can almost sense what he's listening for, the distant roll of surf, the rhythm of waves meeting stones somewhere in the distance ahead. He watches for seabirds as well. Gulls rarely stray far from land. If their calls fade, it signals open ocean. If they grow louder, It means the coast is within reach. The accepted historical view is that Viking navigators relied on auditory cues as a core part of their toolkit, particularly during coastal sailing. They could determine direction by the angle at which waves struck the hull, even in complete darkness. The more unusual detail is that some accounts describe sailors projecting long, sustained vocal tones into fog, each person holding a specific pitch, and using their experienced ears to judge whether the note returned compressed or extended, indicating how far away an obstacle was. Historians still debate whether this practice was purely navigational or carried some ceremonial meaning, part technique, part ritual. As you keep listening, you begin to notice that the sea has its own voice. It mutters, sighs, and occasionally grumbles. The Vikings believed those sounds carried messages, from the gods, or from the spirits said to guard certain waters. Ignoring those voices was considered unwise. Before major voyages, crews would gather in silence and listen for omens in the surf. A sudden splash might signal good fortune. A gull crying at midnight could mean someone wouldn't return. The fog grows denser. Visibility drops to just a few feet. Someone nearby hums a deep, steady tone. The sound travels across the deck and disappears into the mist. A moment later, a faint echo returns, stretched and hollow. The helmsman nods and adjusts course. That returning sound told him what he needed to know. You're witnessing a kind of exchange between sailor and sea, one that most of us no longer have the tools, or the patience, to take part in. You make your way toward the prow, where the carved dragon figurehead faces into the haze. The wood is slick under your palm, worn smooth by years of salt exposure. Around you, the mast creaks and loose ropes knock softly against the sail. Every sound is part of the ship's rhythm. Viking sailors believed they could judge a vessel's structural condition simply by the tone of its movement. Modern shipwrights confirm this. Timber resonates differently when it's under stress or beginning to crack. A trained ear, developed over years, can hear the difference before any visible damage appears. A gust of wind cuts through and the fog breaks apart, revealing a cold blue horizon. Before you can see land, you can smell it, that faint, earthy scent that signals soil rather than open salt water. The crew responds quietly, with recognition. They never question their course. They trusted what they had heard. You lean back and let the wind settle around you. There's a calm in it, but also something thought-provoking. Modern life is saturated with noise, engines, music, constant background chatter. We have largely stopped paying attention to the natural sounds around us. The Vikings did the opposite. They extracted meaning from silence, treating quiet as a resource rather than an absence. The ship moves forward, oars dipping in steady rhythm. Each blade enters the water with a soft whisper, each pull a controlled stroke. One of the sailors hums quietly, a low, measured tone designed not to pass time but to stay in rhythm with the sea's own pulse. You can sense the logic in it. Human rhythm and ocean rhythm finding a shared frequency. The horizon gradually lightens and the fog continues to dissolve. The crew relaxes, some clearing mist from their faces, others exchanging quiet words. Something has shifted. The tension of uncertainty has given way to the confidence of familiarity. The Vikings didn't overpower the sea. They learned to listen to it until it allowed them through. You close your eyes as the last trace of that low hum fades into wind. The water settles around the hull. The ship holds steady beneath you. And for a moment, you almost believe that you, too, could navigate by sound alone. If only you gave yourself enough time and quiet to truly learn how. You lean over the ship's rail, fingertips just touching the cold surface of the water. It moves like dark, weighted glass beneath a pale sky. Every ripple carries something. Every small current tells a quiet story. To the Vikings, the ocean wasn't disorder, it was a conversation. They read it the way others read language, except this language spoke in textures and movement rather than words. As your hand trails through the water, you feel the current shift, barely perceptible, just a slight change in pressure against your fingers. To you, it registers only as cold. To a Viking sailor, it was a navigational signal. These seafarers understood the sea's many dialects, the difference between the steady pulse of deep ocean water and the slow drag of a nearshore tide. Long before charts or instruments existed, They read currents through direct physical contact with the sea. Modern oceanographers confirm that subtle changes in water temperature, foam patterns, and flow direction can genuinely indicate a vessel's position, though that kind of felt knowledge is largely gone from practice. Accounts in Icelandic sagas describe sailors sensing when they were approaching certain shallow waters simply by the increased resistance of the water against the oar. They described it as the sea tightening its grip, as though the land beneath was drawing the water toward it. It reads like imagery. Yet hydrodynamic research today shows that underwater topography does in fact affect surface tension and wave behavior. Those sailors didn't have the scientific framework to explain what they were experiencing. Their hands told them the truth before their minds could process it. One unusual detail from historical records suggests that sailors could assess wind and current direction by dragging a hand behind the stern and observing the foam trail it left. Smooth, even bubbles indicated a tailwind. Broken, jagged trails suggested a crosscurrent. Whether this was genuinely reliable as a navigational method remains uncertain. Maritime archaeologists still debate whether such descriptions were meant literally or served as a kind of sensory shorthand, practical knowledge compressed into memorable imagery and passed down through oral tradition. But there is something compelling about the idea of men placing as much trust in their fingertips as in their eyes. You look down again and watch light move across the surface, shifting the water from deep gray to cold silver in a single moment. The Vikings paid close attention to this as well. They used changes in water color and the play of reflected light to estimate depth. Shallow water glimmered turquoise when sunlight reached the sand below. Deeper channels settled into gray-green, while areas rich with plankton gave off a faint glow at twilight. Sailors still refer to this as reading the color of depth, a practice the Norse had refined centuries before sonar existed. Picture sailing at dawn, surrounded by fog so dense you can barely see your own hand. A soft glow in the water ahead might reveal an approaching current, or the faint shimmer of ice just beneath the surface. They watched how foam gathered along a current's edge, how seabirds drifted along invisible lines of water movement. These signs together formed a living, shifting map. You start to understand that navigation was never solely about the stars. It involved texture, smell, temperature, and accumulated instinct working together. What's particularly striking is how fully embodied that knowledge was. There were no written manuals, no organized lists explaining how to interpret the sea. The understanding lived in muscle memory and trained instinct, passed from father to son, from experienced sailor to apprentice. When a veteran navigator died, a portion of that hard-earned knowledge of the ocean went with him. Some historians argue that this is precisely why Norse oral culture treated seafaring songs with such importance. They weren't simply entertainment. They were a method of preservation. Picture a ship lost in fog, enclosed by gray silence. The crew sits motionless, waiting. The helmsman senses the current pulling at the rudder, not through logical analysis, but through deep familiarity. It's an unusual partnership between person and water. Modern psychology might frame it as pattern recognition. The Vikings might simply have called it respect. There is an account of a helmsman named Arni who claimed he could locate Iceland even when clouds concealed both the sun and the stars. He would drop small pieces of wood into the sea and observe which way they turned. If the wood rotated clockwise, he said, the current was pulling toward home. If it moved in a straight line, he was still far out at sea. Whether the method was reliable, no one can confirm. Some researchers suggest he was observing surface drift caused by the Gulf Stream, centuries before anyone had mapped or named it. You feel the rhythm of the waves beneath you now, a steady, continuous push and pull. Each motion has its own character. Some swells are slow and rounded, shaped by open ocean. Others are short and irregular, generated by nearby land. The Vikings gave these wave patterns names, some soft, some harsh, each with its own identity. They understood that a sudden change in rhythm signaled a shift in the underwater geography below. Something new was rising from the seabed. Your attention returns to the horizon. The ocean appears boundless, but the Vikings knew otherwise. They perceived boundaries where we see only open water. The faintest ripple line could mark where one current ended and another began. a transition zone that might signal a shift from familiar to unknown, or from safety to risk. Modern scientists have noted with interest how accurately Norse sailors tracked these zones, despite having no instruments for measurement. Satellite imaging has since revealed current patterns that closely mirror routes described in ancient accounts, confirming that these navigators understood their environment far more precisely than they were historically given credit for. Their methods weren't rooted in superstition. They were the product of observation refined across centuries. As the wind picks up, cold spray touches your face, sharp and clarifying. For a moment, you grasp what it genuinely meant to trust the sea's signals. To modern listeners, it might sound like poetry, but to those sailors it was a matter of survival. Misreading the water could mean death. Reading it well could mean landfall. You step back from the rail and let the ship's rhythm hold you. The water continues its quiet motion below, carrying information that only the patient can access. Knowledge, it turns out, isn't always recorded in writing. Sometimes it moves, drifts and ripples, waiting for someone calm enough to pay attention. Night settles around the longship like a heavy cloak. The sea moves slowly and steadily beneath the hull, while the sky opens wide overhead, filled with cold, sharp light. The stars appear almost unnervingly clear. This was the oldest navigation chart in the world, drawn not in ink, but in starlight. You tilt your head back and the sky fills your view. The Vikings knew every part of it. Long before telescopes or compasses, they sailed by these distant points of light. But they didn't see the sky the way we do today. Where we look for constellations, neat shapes outlined by long-dead astronomers, they saw families, rivalries, and warnings. The stars were not static markers. They were active presences, their relationships to one another as meaningful as their individual brightness. To navigate by them, you didn't memorize patterns. You memorized the spaces between them. Evidence from medieval Norse texts suggests that navigators treated the night sky almost like a musical arrangement. Each star held a position within a larger order. Modern astrophysicists have observed that Viking sky reading appears to have focused on angles rather than fixed lines, using the distances between stars to hold a bearing. It resembles listening to a piece of music and sensing when a note is slightly off. You may not be able to measure it precisely, but you register it. A detail from a 13th century Icelandic manuscript describes a technique few people are aware of today. Sailors would stare at the stars until their vision softened, then shift their gaze slightly to one side. In that indirect line of sight, they could make out dimmer stars invisible to direct viewing. They had no explanation for why it worked. Modern physiology does. The human eye detects faint light more effectively away from the center of vision. The Vikings had arrived at that discovery entirely through practice and repetition. Try it yourself now. Look up and fix your gaze hard on a single star. It disappears. Relax your focus and let your eyes settle, and it returns. This is what they understood. Navigation isn't only about looking. It's about knowing how to see. The North Star served as the fixed point, steady, reliable, always marking north regardless of season. The Vikings called it Leirstjarna, the guiding star, and believed it connected the human world to the realm of the gods. Its angle above the horizon could indicate latitude, though they had no instruments to measure that angle precisely. Some scholars suggest they used stacked fists held at arm's length to estimate degrees, a rough but surprisingly workable technique that modern survivalists have independently rediscovered. Even so, the sky wasn't always available. Fog, heavy cloud cover, or the continuous daylight of northern summers frequently concealed the stars entirely. In those conditions, they turned to other signals. The faint glow of dusk on one side of the horizon, or the first spread of dawn on the other, revealed the sun's position even when it couldn't be seen directly. They also noted how twilight color lingered longer in certain directions. From those clues alone, they could determine their general orientation. It's remarkable how little light they actually needed to stay on course. You can almost hear their quiet exchanges on deck, low voices naming stars the way others name old acquaintances. The bear, the swan, the wagon. Each held not just directional value but moral meaning. The bear was said to protect travelers. The swan gave warning of approaching storms. The wagon, what we now call the Big Dipper, pointed the way home. Their mythology and their geography were inseparable. To navigate was also to move through a living story. One early source mentions a wandering star that some crews believed signaled rough weather ahead. It was likely a planet, mistaken for an unusual moving light. Sailors would debate quietly about its meaning, some calling it Thor's torch, others describing it as the eye of a man lost at sea. Whether interpreted as practical warning or spiritual sign, such lights kept sailors alert and observant. Modern researchers have noted that these kinds of myths frequently encoded useful knowledge. When certain planets appeared above the horizon at specific times of year, seasonal wind shifts tended to follow. You imagine standing on that dark deck, breath condensing in the cold air, eyes open to the full depth of the sky above. No compass rose, no margin for error, only trust in patterns, in memory, in the unbroken thread between ship and sky. Even today, that simplicity feels sacred. We have traded wonder for precision. They had both woven together. The rhythm of oars slows as night deepens. Somewhere a man hums an old verse about the whale road. The sea stretches toward the edge of the world. Stars shimmer like scattered frost. You begin to understand that each sailor carried his own internal map, built not from ink, but from light and muscle memory. Navigation was almost a form of meditation, a balance between awareness and surrender. A fragment from a later chronicle describes a helmsman who claimed he could sense when clouds covered a star simply by the change in his own heartbeat. Scientists might dismiss that, but even today, pilots speak of spatial disorientation when cut off from the stars. The body understands more than we acknowledge. The Vikings trusted that understanding completely. The sky turns faintly silver at the edges. Dawn is approaching, erasing constellations one by one. You feel a quiet pang as they disappear, as though old companions are slipping below the horizon. But the sailors do not mourn. They turn toward a new light, another tool ready to guide them. The stars rest, but the sea never does. Dawn creeps in softly, pale gold brushing the rim of the water. Stars withdraw one by one, and the air holds that strange stillness before the world decides to wake. You stand near the prow, watching sunlight filter through a slow curtain of mist. The crew stirs, adjusting ropes, murmuring in the low rhythm of routine, but one man stands perfectly still, holding a small crystal up to the sky. It catches the light and glows faintly. You realize you are watching something that sits right on the boundary between myth and science. That crystal is what later centuries called a sunstone. Not a gem of legend, but a real piece of calcite or cordierite that Viking sailors may have used to locate the hidden sun on overcast days. The idea sounds almost too ingenious to be ancient. Yet fragments of Icelandic sagas describe it plainly. One passage tells of King Olaf's navigator, who raised a stone to find the sun's direction after fog had consumed the sky entirely. For centuries, historians treated this as poetic invention. Then mineralogists tested the concept, and the results surprised them. Certain crystals can polarize light, splitting it into two distinct rays. When rotated slowly, one ray brightens while the other dims, revealing the sun's orientation even when it remains invisible. Modern experiments conducted in Iceland and Denmark confirmed that the method works with remarkable accuracy, within just a few degrees of the true solar position. What once sounded like folklore turned out to be early applied optics. The Vikings may have discovered this through chance, or through careful observation of the natural world. One curious note from a 10th century text mentions sailors keeping two such stones of different colors, perhaps to determine which produced the clearer reading. Whether that detail is historically accurate or embellished, it reflects how methodical these mariners actually were. They did not depend on luck alone. They tested, compared, and refined their methods. A number of these navigators might well be called scientists by modern standards, even if that word never existed in their world. Not everyone agrees on how widespread the practice was. Some researchers believe the sunstone was more symbolic than functional, a charm representing clarity of vision. Others argue it was essential equipment, especially in northern latitudes where twilight could last through the entire night. The debate continues, shifting between evidence and interpretation. But the image is easy to picture. A helmsman raising a glowing shard toward a gray sky, watching for the faint shift in brightness that points the way forward. Imagine standing there yourself. The horizon around you dissolves into mist. The world is featureless and gray. Yet in your palm, a small piece of crystal carries quiet knowledge. You rotate it slowly, watching the light change. Somewhere inside that subtle movement lies the direction of east. It is both simple and profound. This link between close observation and survival runs deep in Norse seafaring culture. These sailors paid attention to details that most modern people never notice. How light shifts on the water's surface, how brightness bends across low clouds, how reflections move across the wet planks of a ship. These patterns became their compass. They read polarization, glare, and the faint shimmer of morning haze the way others read a written page. The crew begins to raise the sail. Sunlight pushes through the mist, turning it to pale silver. The longship's carved figurehead gleams, water sliding from its edges. Laughter rises among the men, the kind that follows relief. The storm has passed. The route ahead is open. Someone wraps the sunstone carefully in cloth and sets it aside. It is not treated as treasure. It is treated as a tool, practical, modest, and quietly extraordinary. Archaeologists once doubted that Vikings could have mastered such refined navigational methods. Then a fragment of calcite turned up in a later British shipwreck, suggesting the technique may have survived well beyond the Viking era. Some specialists even propose that this forgotten knowledge influenced later mariners without anyone recognizing its origin. That idea is worth sitting with. How many modern advances are simply rediscoveries of methods long since lost? You move closer to the edge of the ship and let the rising wind reach your face. The world feels sharper now, colors more vivid after the gray. The sea mirrors sunlight in broken pieces of gold. For a moment, you understand why a sailor might describe the water as liquid light. That is precisely what the sunstone captured, a fragment of brilliance held steady in one hand, pointing toward home. And still, a quiet thought surfaces. What must it have felt like to place that much trust in something so fragile? One overcast morning could mean the difference between survival and loss. Yet these sailors faced such mornings without panic. The crystal might fail. The clouds might hold. But they believed that patience, sooner or later, would reveal direction. That is a lesson that carries across centuries. When clarity is hidden, persistence becomes the real compass. You look back at the crew. Their movements are calm and deliberate. They do not fight the sea. They move in step with it. Every sound, the creak of ropes, the pull of the sail, reflects that same balance between control and acceptance. The sun rises higher, cutting through the last traces of mist. The horizon opens wide, bright and unobstructed. The voyage continues, guided by a flicker of light inside a crystal, and by instincts older than written record. The longship settles into a steady rhythm as the sail fills. Woven wool stretches taut against invisible force. Ropes pull tight, the mast shifts slightly, and the vessel comes fully alive. You feel the pulse of it underfoot. The Vikings understood this dynamic better than most. To them, wind was not simply weather. It was a presence, capable of carrying or destroying. They learned to work with it through sound and feel, not calculation. Close your eyes for a moment and listen. The canvas hums, deep and consistent. Ropes whistle at their tensest points. A sailor adjusts a knot with quiet focus. This is not approximation. It is dialogue. The ship responds to every small change, and the crew listens with the attentiveness of musicians tuning an instrument by ear. Archaeological reconstructions of Viking vessels reveal the precision behind their design. The square sail, simple in appearance, was a sophisticated and flexible tool. Its angle could be shifted to capture or release air, giving the crew real control even in unpredictable conditions. Modern wind tunnel experiments confirm that Viking sails performed surprisingly well even when sailing across the wind, not just downwind. It's remarkable how engineering and instinct worked together long before aerodynamics had a name. One rarely discussed detail about Viking rigging is that the sailcloth itself carried layers of meaning. Sailors soaked it in animal fat, fish oil, or even milk to make it resistant to water and wind. Each crew had its own formula, passed down like a family tradition. The mixture not only waterproofed the sail but also changed its color, sometimes giving it a reddish tone under sunlight. That shimmer could serve as a signal to distant allies or a warning to rivals. You watch as the wind shifts slightly, and the helmsman adjusts course without a word. His hand rests lightly on the tiller, yet every small movement matters. The balance between sail, rudder, and sea is delicate. Modern sailors use instruments to detect such changes. The Vikings relied entirely on their bodies. They could sense a shift in wind direction through the texture of air on their cheeks. That may sound exaggerated, but studies on long-distance rowers and traditional sailors show how heightened awareness develops after years at sea. The Vikings simply embodied it. There's a story from an old Greenlandic chronicle about a sailor who could predict the weather by the way smoke from his pipe bent. He would blow a ring, watch it twist, and declare what kind of day lay ahead. People dismissed it as superstition until his forecasts proved accurate time after time. Modern meteorology would explain it as reading air currents and humidity. But to his crewmates, it seemed like something beyond explanation. The line between skill and sorcery was always blurred on the open ocean. The wind stiffens now and the ship begins to lean slightly. The crew responds without hesitation. Some tighten ropes, others shift their weight. They don't speak. Every action is practiced. Every movement part of a shared rhythm. It's as if the entire vessel is one body moving in harmony with the sea. You can understand why later poets described longships as living creatures. Their prows lifted like heads, their sails worked like lungs. The Vikings treated them with the respect given to a companion. A tradition mentioned in several sagas describes how some captains spoke to their ships as if to calm them before a storm. The words were gentle, almost like lullabies. Modern historians interpret this as ritualized psychology, a way to steady the nerves of the crew. But sailors swore it worked. A calm ship, they said, survived better than a fearful one. The wind shifts again, colder now, carrying the faint smell of approaching rain. The helmsman studies the clouds, reading their shape. He doesn't see mere weather, he sees intention. Thick gray lines rising from the horizon signal heavy gusts. Thin streaks across a pale sky suggest steady breezes. Every Viking child grew up learning those signs. When they spoke of wind gods, they were naming patterns of air they understood deeply. You look up at the sail again. It strains, flutters, then settles. The ropes creak with tension. This is the Viking sailor's true skill, knowing when to resist and when to give way. A novice might tighten every line, but an experienced hand loosens some, letting the ship breathe. Even the strongest wind becomes manageable if the sail knows how to move with it. There's a kind of wisdom in that partnership. We often think of control as force, but here it means listening. When the sea and wind clash, the ship becomes the mediator. Standing here, you can almost sense that exchange. 1,000 invisible forces pulling, twisting, balancing. You hear the sound of wind moving through the rigging and realize that this sound guided entire civilizations across unknown waters. As the gust fades, calm returns. The sail catches stray rays of sunlight. You can smell the oily wool, the salt drying on its surface, the faint trace of tar. These scents once meant safety. They meant direction, movement, and hope. The Vikings may not have had compasses, but they had confidence. A trust built through deep familiarity with their vessels and the world they sailed through. The horizon stretches ahead, open and vast. The ship moves onward, the wind offering quiet approval. You feel the same steady certainty that must have carried those long voyages forward. Not arrogance, but faith in motion itself. The wind may change and the sea may rise, but those who pay attention will always find their way. The ship glides smoothly now, its hull humming softly as it rides the rolling swells. You rest your hand on the railing and feel a faint vibration beneath your palm, a low, steady pulse, like the breathing of some large animal. The Vikings often said that a well-made ship was alive, that the wood itself held a spirit. Looking around, you begin to understand why. Everything here moves. The ropes shift, the planks creak, the mast sways. Nothing is still. Each longship had a name, not for decoration, but for identity. The Islander, the Sea Stallion, the Wave Serpent. These weren't poetic labels. They were acknowledgments of a bond. Before every voyage, the crew would offer a small gesture of respect to their vessel. Sometimes a pour of ale across the bow, sometimes a quiet blessing. To them, the ship was not a tool. It was a companion with its own moods and memory. Archaeologists studying ship remains from Roskilde and Oseberg have noted something striking. The timbers were cut so that the natural curve of the tree followed the curve of the hull. This made the wood stronger and more flexible. It also meant that each plank carried the grain's original energy, bending like muscle rather than resisting pressure. Running your fingers along the rail, you can almost sense that tension. The tree's life reshaped into a vessel that swims rather than stands. A 12th century Icelandic saga mentions sailors claiming they could tell when a ship was nearing land. They said it would hum differently, the sound of its timbers shifting in tone as the shore drew close. Researchers can't fully explain this, though some suggest it may relate to shallow waves reflecting beneath the hull. The physics are plausible, even if the imagery goes beyond them. Close your eyes and listen. The ship's voice is low but constant, a mix of groan and rhythm. Each wave makes it speak a little differently. The Vikings knew these sounds intimately. A sudden new creak could indicate danger, a weakened joint or too much strain. Shipwrights taught their sons to identify such changes by ear, a method some modern boat builders still apply today. They didn't simply construct ships. They tuned them. At times, the relationship between sailor and ship approached something closer to devotion. An account from a Greenland expedition describes how a crew refused to abandon their sinking vessel. They believed that deserting her would leave their souls without direction. Eventually, they secured themselves to the deck and waited for a rescue that never arrived. Whether embellished or not, the story reveals the emotional depth invested in these wooden structures. The wind shifts once more, filling the sail with a deep rush of air. You feel the sudden surge as the ship accelerates, and your heartbeat rises to match its pace. The helmsman smiles faintly, eyes fixed on the horizon, hands steady on the tiller. He issues no commands. None are needed. Every crew member feels what the vessel feels. There is no divide between man and ship. That connection is what carried them through storms that would have destroyed lesser crews. One lesser-known practice involved listening to the hull through the floorboards. A sailor would press his ear against the deck to judge whether the ship was moving too fast or whether currents had shifted direction. Modern sailors rely on instruments for that now. But the underlying principle remains sound. Literally. Under certain conditions, water rushing along the keel produces distinct tones. Trained ears could determine whether they were gliding over deep ocean or drifting dangerously close to shore. You breathe in the scent of wet pine and tar. It's earthy and familiar. For the Norse, this was the smell of home and survival. Shipbuilders spent months preparing timber, coating it with tar extracted from burning pine roots. A process so potent the aroma could persist for decades. That fragrance signaled safety. It meant the hull was sealed firmly against the freezing sea. Even today, replica Viking ships carry that same smell, as though memory is preserved in every molecule of resin. What stands out most is how the Vikings fused engineering with emotion. Their ships were simultaneously art and armor. Every line of the hull followed practical logic, yet every carving and every curve carried spirit. The dragon heads mounted at the prow were not merely decorative. They were guardians intended to intimidate spirits or enemies. Yet when approaching friendly shores, crews would sometimes remove or cover those fierce figures. They believed it was wrong to bring fear to peaceful land. Waves slap softly against the sides. The rhythm is steady, almost hypnotic. You begin to think of the ship as a living companion, just as they did. You imagine it dreaming of calm harbors, humming quietly in its rest. Perhaps that was the true secret of their success at sea, not only craftsmanship or courage, but empathy. They treated the ocean and their vessel as conscious presences to be understood, not dominated. A modern ship is largely silent, its engines drowning out everything else. But here you hear it all. The rush of water beneath the keel, the sigh of wind through the rigging, the low groan of planks expanding with salt. Every sound carries information. Every vibration offers a clue. To the Vikings, this was navigation just as much as any star or stone. As the day edges toward evening, the sea flattens into a glassy calm. The ship slows, settling as if content. The crew leans back, eyes half closed, tuned to the gentle rhythm beneath them. You understand that the voyage is not only about covering distance. It is about balance, finding the precise point where wood, wind, and will move together as one. You reach down, touch the deck again, and feel it pulse faintly under your hand. The ship needs no words to communicate. It already knows where it is headed. The sea shifts as you move farther from land. The waves spread wider and smoother, like the surface of a sleeping creature. The ship rides them easily, gliding rather than cutting. The air changes too, cooler, cleaner, with a faint sweetness that only deep water carries. For Viking sailors, this was familiar ground. They called these open passages Halather, sea paths, invisible highways connecting their dispersed world. They knew these routes not from markings on parchment, but from the feel of the currents beneath them. Every voyage began with studying the tides, observing how they pulled along the shoreline. Some currents were seasonal, others permanent. The Vikings memorized them with a precision that rivals modern ocean charts. Contemporary oceanographers, mapping North Atlantic drift patterns, discovered that many align almost perfectly with the sailing routes described in the sagas. What was once treated as legend turns out to be empirical navigation preserved in oral tradition. A surviving account from Greenland describes how mariners predicted currents by observing kelp drift. If the seaweed lay flat along the surface, the water was steady. If it twisted or vanished beneath the waves, hidden undercurrents were at work. To confirm direction, sailors sometimes tossed small pieces of wood into the water and watched how they moved relative to the ship's heading. It was a quiet, simple, and endlessly practical method. One detail rarely covered in textbooks is how they used sea color to identify different zones of travel. The northern drift near Iceland appeared steel blue, cold and heavy. The southern drift toward Britain ran green-gold, warmer and smoother. These were not poetic flourishes. They reflected genuine differences in light, salinity, and water temperature. Sailors read these indicators as clearly as we read road signs today. Some historians argue that they navigated by memorizing sequences of sensory cues rather than abstract distances. A route might be described as follows: 2 days of heavy swell, then lighter air, then warmer scent, then a bird call from the south. It was a symphony of observation, not a set of coordinates. In a world without maps, memory became geography. Old accounts tell of sailors who could sense the transition from one current to another because the ship's motion changed beneath them. They said the sea began to breathe differently. Scientists now understand why wavelength and speed vary between warm and cold water, producing distinct patterns of movement under the hull. The body, when properly trained, can detect these shifts without conscious effort. What might appear mystical was, in fact, refined sensory intelligence. Standing near the stern, you notice the air itself carries new character. There is a faint trace of iron, possibly volcanic dust carried on the wind. The Vikings would have registered that as well. They treated scent and temperature as components of their internal compass. Warm, dry air suggested currents from the south. Sharp, icy gusts indicated the northern drift was near. Today we depend on barometers and radar. They depended on their own skin. A striking custom persisted among certain crews. Before a long voyage, they would release a small carved figure into the sea and observe how it moved. If it drifted freely in one direction, that was the route to follow. If it spun or lingered near the ship, departure was postponed. It may sound like superstition, but the motion of that figure revealed surface flow and current resistance. Faith and physics operated quietly in parallel. As afternoon light softens, the water ahead gleams with silver streaks, rip lines where opposing currents converge. Modern sailors mark these as turbulence zones. The Vikings called them sea seams. They believed crossing them required respect, silence, restraint, sometimes a small offering or a song. Experience had taught them that when two bodies of water clashed, ships that forced passage often broke apart. What continues to intrigue scholars is how accurately they timed their voyages around these flows. Archaeological dating shows that expeditions to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland consistently fell within the same seasonal windows that modern sailors still consider optimal. They must have maintained detailed oral calendars tracking when each current turned favorable. Those records have not survived, but traces remain in saga accounts of journeys that always departed under the same stars and concluded at the same phase of the moon. It is a vast, shifting web, a living map in constant motion. The Vikings didn't simply cross it. They became part of it. To them, mastery meant harmony. Fighting the current was foolish. Following it was wisdom. As night falls, faint phosphorescence appears in the water. Tiny sparks of green and blue flicker along the ship's sides. The sailors watch in silence. They called this sea fire, believing it to be the work of spirits lighting their path. We now recognize it as bioluminescent plankton reacting to movement. The science is modern, but the sense of wonder is ancient. You lean over the edge, watching the glowing trail dissolve into the darkness. Somewhere below, the current you follow stretches across half the world, unseen, yet constant. It links continents, histories, and people. Perhaps that is what the Vikings truly grasped, that the ocean is not a barrier, but a thread binding everything together. Morning arrives again, pale and fresh, with a light wind moving across the surface of the sea. The air feels softer now, carrying something earthy within it. You breathe deeply and catch faint traces of pine, tar, and distant smoke. The crew stirs with quiet satisfaction. To them, scent is not atmosphere. It is intelligence. The Vikings understood that the sea carried smell just as reliably as it carried sound or light. Before sight or sound could signal land, the nose often did it first. The earliest hint of shore was not always visible cliffs or overhead birds. It was the smell of soil, moss, and timber drifting on the wind. Accounts from early Norse voyages describe sailors waking from sleep and announcing that they could smell land hours before anyone could see it. We might question that today. Yet science supports the claim. Coastal breezes carry airborne organic compounds from forests and marshes far out to sea. Researchers studying modern navigators in comparable environments have confirmed that under calm weather, humans can detect terrestrial scents across dozens of nautical miles. What the Vikings lacked in instruments, they compensated for by sharpening their senses. When you spend your life exposed to salt, wood, and fish, any deviation becomes noticeable immediately. There is a remarkable entry in a medieval Icelandic text describing a sailor who identified the shores of Greenland by the taste of the wind. The phrase reads as poetic until you understand he meant it literally. The salt in the air tasted sharper, richer with minerals from glacial dust. It was a sensory memory as reliable as any visual reference. In an era without weather charts or barometers, taste and smell served as early warning systems. Another unusual but telling custom appears in several sagas. Before departure, the helmsman would smell a handful of seaweed collected from the home harbor, then compare that scent to the sea encountered during the voyage. If the smell grew fresher or warmer, they believed they were moving toward familiar waters. If it turned sharp and unfamiliar, they suspected foreign currents ahead. Whether this practice was genuinely effective or simply built confidence is difficult to confirm, but the gesture reveals just how physical and instinctive Viking navigation truly was. You close your eyes and attempt to sense what they sensed. The breeze touches your skin like cool fabric. Beneath the salt lies something deeper, resin, perhaps, from distant pine forests, or the faint sweetness of peat smoke from unseen settlements. It feels like a quiet signal from somewhere known. No instrument could register such detail, yet to a Norse crew it was sufficient to confirm direction. Not every scent promised safety. The sea warned of danger as well. Sailors recognized the smell of approaching storms, a metallic edge that preceded lightning. They also knew the stench of rotting seaweed on hidden reefs, which indicated shallow water or shipbreaking rocks nearby. Their vocabulary for scent was far richer than ours. Where we might say fishy or briny, they had numerous words describing the different qualities of the sea's breath. It is worth noting that in Norse mythology, smell is frequently associated with memory and foresight. Odin himself is said to know by scent what unfolds in distant worlds. That belief may well have grown from the seafaring life itself. Scent connects past and present without delay, the smell of home, of tar, of wind over kelp. You can picture sailors returning after months away, closing their eyes, inhaling slowly, and knowing exactly where they were before any coastline appeared. You glance toward the mast, where strips of sailcloth dry in the sun. The odor of tar rises sharply, mixed with the tang of fish oil used to seal the ropes. It is both unpleasant and reassuring. The very materials that smell the strongest are also the ones that hold the ship together. There is a lesson in that balance. The boundary between discomfort and survival is narrower than we tend to assume. One of the more unusual theories about Viking navigation proposes that they may have used dogs to confirm proximity to land. Certain sagas mention animals on board trained to react when they caught familiar scents from home shores. No archaeological evidence fully supports this, but it would suit their practical creativity perfectly. A dog's sense of smell far exceeds any human ability, and these sailors were never too proud to draw from what nature offered. The wind shifts, and with it arrives a new scent, cold, clean, edged with salt crystals. The helmsman squints toward the horizon. Nothing is visible yet, but the smell delivers its answer. Open ocean ahead. No land within reach. The crew settles back into rhythm, trusting the air completely. It strikes you that while we pursue precision through technology, they pursued accuracy through attention. They did not need to be exact. They needed to remain aware. In that awareness lies something we have largely set aside: the body's capacity to read the surrounding world without any translation required. You breathe again, slower this time, taking in the blend of pine, salt, and distant rain. Each element feels ancient, like a memory that predates language. You find yourself wondering how many voyages began with that same breath, and how many ended because someone failed to listen to what the wind was trying to say. The ship moves on. The scent of land fades, replaced by the steady neutrality of open water. For now, there is only salt and timber, constant and unending. Somewhere ahead, another coastline waits, its invisible presence already drifting quietly toward you. The air is cool and clear as morning deepens. The horizon carries a faint silver line where sky meets water. A sharp call breaks the stillness. You look up and spot a dark shape cutting across the light, wings fully extended, feathers catching the sun. Then another follows. Then another. The Vikings would have raised their heads too, recognizing their most dependable companions, the seabirds. They understood early that birds were more consistent than any compass. A gull or a puffin does not move without purpose. Each follows a pattern tied to land and feeding grounds. Watching them told a sailor more about distance and direction than any drawn chart could. You lift your face toward the sky, following their movements, and you begin to perceive what Norse navigators perceived: a living map composed entirely of flight. According to Icelandic accounts, sailors carried trained ravens on board. When land disappeared from view, they would release one into the air. If it circled and came back, open sea stretched too far in every direction. If it flew straight and did not return, land lay somewhere along that bearing. The method is so straightforward that historians believe it was standard practice, not simply legend. The first raven returned quickly. The second hovered briefly, then came back without direction. But the third flew northwest and disappeared. Floki followed that path and found the island he was searching for. What reads like myth today was once a form of practical field science. Ornithologists note that ravens, gulls, and auks each have specific flight ranges from land. Observing the height and angle of a bird's flight could tell a sailor not only where to head, but how far they still were from shore. Those who survived enough voyages eventually learned to distinguish species by wingbeat and call alone. One striking fragment from a Norse poem describes how sailors interpreted the calls of puffins. The phrase confused scholars for years until a marine biologist pointed out that puffins vocalize differently depending on whether they are flying toward feeding grounds or nesting cliffs. To a trained ear, those sounds could genuinely serve as directional cues. Whether the Vikings understood the biology or not, they understood the pattern. You can picture it clearly. A group of sailors standing in silence, eyes focused as a single bird dips low over the water. They would watch not just its path, but the way the wind pressed against its wings, the distance it covered before turning. At times, they altered course entirely based on a bird's hesitation. To modern thinking, that might seem unreliable, but these men trusted what the sky communicated. A practical detail surfaces in several old travel logs. Some captains carried cages of pigeons on board, not as pets, but as messengers. Released one by one, they could relay signals to ships trailing behind, or return to known harbors if a fleet became separated. It was an early form of communication, invisible to history until fragments of wooden cages were recovered from preserved shipwrecks. Watching the birds, you begin to register their efficiency. They rise and fall with the wind, never working against it more than necessary. Every movement conserves energy. The Vikings reflected that behavior in their sailing. They believed that to travel well, one had to move like a bird, responding to conditions rather than resisting them. The ship beneath you feels suddenly lighter, almost weightless. A quiet academic question persists about whether certain birds were considered sacred guides. Some texts suggest ravens were not only navigational aids, but symbols of Odin himself, messengers between worlds. Others believe that association was meaning layered over older habits of careful observation. Whatever the case, when a bird appeared far out at sea, it was never dismissed. It indicated direction, and perhaps something more. Consider the feeling of spotting the first gull after days of fog. The crew would call out, their faces lifted with relief. That single pair of wings meant the voyage was approaching safety. The scent of land might follow not long after, or the faint brown streak of a distant coastline emerging from the haze. Even the sound of those birds, their cries cutting through days of silence, must have felt like a kind of music. Modern sailors sometimes rediscover this instinct. Bird migration corridors still trace many of the same routes that Viking vessels once traveled. The North Atlantic remains full of wings during certain seasons, though few today stop long enough to pay attention. The old navigators had no such luxury. They needed every clue, every flicker of movement that the sky offered. You look upward again. The gulls have shrunk to small distant specks. The wind moves softly through the rigging. The helmsman adjusts course slightly, perhaps echoing what his ancestors did 1,000 years ago when birds pointed the way. There is a quiet humility in that gesture. It acknowledges that understanding often comes from creatures far smaller than ourselves. As the sun climbs higher, the birds drift away toward unseen cliffs. The sea grows still once more, but the image remains. The arc of wings, the suggestion of land somewhere beyond the visible edge. You come to understand that navigation is not simply about locating a point on a chart. It is about attending to the world around you until it offers direction on its own. The ship moves forward, guided by instinct, by rhythm, by the faint trace of flight still present in the air above. Somewhere ahead lies land, waiting for those who know how to read its signals before the shore ever comes into view. The day brightens gradually. The sea lies like polished stone beneath a cloudless sky. You lean over the rail and look down into water so clear you can watch its color shift from turquoise to deep steel. The Vikings understood this language of shades. To them, color was not aesthetic. It was measurement, orientation, and at times, forewarning. Archaeological records from known ship routes suggest that Viking sailors frequently steered by hue, distinguishing safe depth from hazard simply by how the surface appeared. Near the coasts of Norway, water turned green where sunlight caught shallow sand. Over deep trenches, it darkened to blue-black, a signal to proceed carefully. That understanding came not from theory but from repetition, generations of eyes learning to translate light into knowledge. A detail preserved in a 13th century saga notes that when the sea greened with foam, it indicated plankton were present and fish were abundant nearby. What sounds like metaphor is actually early ecological observation. Marine scientists now confirm that plankton blooms alter the color of the sea, shifting it toward vivid green in nutrient-rich zones. The Vikings read these patterns with an expertise that required no formal name. One curious passage from a later chronicle describes sailors who reported seeing pale shapes moving beneath the hull, ribbons of brightness that appeared only before storms. At the time, no explanation existed. Modern science identifies it as bioluminescence, microorganisms glowing in disturbed water as oxygen levels shift. The sailors could not name the cause, but they recognized what it signaled. Rough weather was coming. You lean farther over and catch a flash of silver as a shoal passes below. The Vikings would have noted that too. They referred to such moments as sea mirrors, believing the ocean revealed its condition through its brightness. Dull water suggested stillness or stagnation. Bright, moving water meant life and current. To them, light itself carried meaning. It is recorded that some navigators carried polished bronze bowls to collect seawater during their voyages. They observed how the color changed as the liquid settled. When it turned cloudy, they understood they were near river mouths or drifting ice. When it remained clear and deep blue, open ocean surrounded them. These small acts of observation built a vocabulary of color more precise than many modern assumptions allow. Scholars continue to debate how far this perceptual system extended. Some argue that the Vikings developed their own form of chromatic compass, associating particular shades with consistent directions. The theory remains speculative, but patterns within old sailing songs suggest it has merit. Certain verses describe eastward blue and westward green, pointing to stable associations between color and cardinal orientation. Whether these reflected method or coincidence remains an open question. As you look into the shifting water, the surface glows faintly with light reflected from the sky, a layer alive with quiet motion. The Vikings saw something purposeful in that shimmer. They spoke of Aegir, the sea deity, stirring his golden vessel to blend currents and tides. The foam was his work, the color a reflection of his temper. Belief and observation merged without conflict. Faith, in this case, sharpened attention rather than replacing it. Modern sailors sometimes return to this instinct without fully realizing it. They speak of the feel of a sea, the way color responds to temperature changes, the quality of light beneath different skies. The Vikings lived entirely by those signals. A green horizon could mean shallows ahead. A sudden shift toward gray might mean fog was moving in. Even the brightness of distant water revealed the direction of sunlight filtering through cloud cover. You crouch at the edge of the deck, watching light refract through a thin layer of foam. The colors run deep, green, gold, blue, and white, weaving together in shifting patterns. It feels almost hypnotic. Somewhere within that shimmer lies a map, one that cannot be drawn but must be read through direct experience. You picture the crew doing the same thing centuries earlier, every eye trained to catch the slightest change. There is an account of a helmsman who guided his ship through ice fields by studying the water's tint. He maintained that certain shades of blue revealed safe passages between ice flows. Researchers who later examined Arctic explorers found the same technique still in use. Water near ice does indeed reflect different wavelengths depending on thickness and depth below the surface. That knowledge had survived through oral tradition long after anyone could recall its origin. You stand up, the wind moving across your face. The sea stretches outward in endless gradients, each one holding information. The Vikings had no need to measure. They simply recognized what they saw. Perhaps that is what we have lost, the patience to observe long enough for meaning to surface. The ship continues forward, sunlight playing across its wake. Behind you, the water brightens into silver streaks, fading gradually back to blue. You feel a quiet appreciation for this overlooked skill, the ability to read the world not as scenery, but as information written in light. The horizon glows softly ahead, and for a moment, the sea feels as though it is pointing the way forward. The sky begins to fill with cloud. Long gray bands stretch across the sun. The light softens and dims, and the wind shifts in pitch. Every Viking sailor knew that change well. To them, clouds were not background. They were indicators. Each shape, each movement, each variation in tone carried meaning. As you look upward now, you recognize that the sky was once a second ocean to them, one they learned to navigate with their eyes alone. The sagas contain passages describing captains who studied the sky before departing. This was not superstition. modern meteorologists acknowledge that many of their observations hold up. A ring around the moon signaled moisture in the air, an early sign of approaching rain. High, feathery cirrus clouds suggested stable conditions ahead, while low, dense formations crawling along the horizon warned of strengthening wind. You can picture the quiet tension as a helmsman looked up, his expression alone enough to prompt the crew to tighten the lines without a word spoken. A notable detail recorded in several Icelandic texts is that the Vikings classified clouds by behavior rather than appearance. Instead of naming them for what they resembled, they named them for how they moved, whether they ran, rested, or dragged slowly across the sun. It was a system shaped by constant exposure, more instinctive than scientific, yet well-suited to life at sea. One lesser-known method involved studying the reflection of clouds on the water's surface. The Vikings observed that certain cloud types cast sharper, brighter reflections in calm conditions. The clearer the reflection, the denser the air above, which frequently preceded fog or heavy rain. Early meteorologists later confirmed that atmospheric optical density does affect how clouds appear on reflective surfaces. The sailors had no framework for the physics, but they understood the signals. A passage from a Greenland voyage recounts sailors predicting a storm by how quickly seabirds dropped toward the waves. They said the birds were responding to the sky. Scientists now understand that birds detect changes in barometric pressure well before humans register them. The Vikings had no instruments for that measurement, yet they observed the same behavior and drew the same conclusions. Experience served as their equipment. The air around you feels heavy now. The scent of rain mingles with salt. The helmsman glances upward, eyes narrowed toward a gap in the clouds where light filters through in pale streams. You study his face, calm and concentrated, and understand that he is reading, much as you might read a page of text. Every wisp, every shadow, every shift in brightness is a sentence in a language that has almost disappeared. They watched the horizon continuously because clouds near the far edge of vision told more than those directly overhead. A faint haze could indicate distant land. A low bank of rolling fog often concealed drifting ice. One saga includes a line where a sailor claims to see through the air to locate Greenland. Scholars now believe this was not poetic language, but an observation of atmospheric refraction, the bending of light at high latitudes that can make landmasses appear where none should be visible. For those sailors, illusion and reality occasionally merged into the same signal. You can understand how their practical knowledge became woven into mythology. When clouds moved fast and strangely, they said Thor's goats were racing across the sky. When the sea glowed green beneath a pale sun, they said the gods were testing their nerve. Belief gave their world a narrative structure, but beneath it lay genuine understanding. Those stories carried knowledge across generations who had no written guides to rely on. Some modern researchers argue that the Vikings could forecast weather nearly as accurately as 19th-century sailors, relying entirely on observation. They timed departures around what they called the good sky, a formation of stable, pale clouds stretching eastward. When that pattern appeared, it meant roughly 3 days of calm conditions. This was not guesswork. It was statistical memory preserved in verse and repeated across generations. You look at the clouds again. They are moving faster now, their edges fraying into mist. The light beneath them shifts toward green, and the waves grow sharper. The ship creaks as the wind builds, but the crew shows no concern. They recognize this kind of weather, brief, forceful, more noise than consequence. The helmsman calls out softly, adjusting the sail, and the longship turns with ease. The Vikings built vessels designed to respond instantly, their curved hulls gliding through waves rather than opposing them. Rain begins to fall, tapping steadily against the deck. You listen to the sound, even and unhurried. Somewhere in that rhythm, you sense the same composure those sailors must have carried. To them, weather was not a threat to endure but a message to interpret. Those who paid attention stayed safe. The rain gradually eases and sunlight breaks through again, scattering brightness across the water. The clouds separate like curtains drawing back. You exhale slowly, the tension releasing. Above you, the sky settles into that clear, luminous quality that follows a northern storm. For a brief moment, You understand what it meant to trust the sky so completely. It was not a reliance on chance, but a partnership with the natural world. They navigated by observation, patience, and respect, tools as essential as any oar or sail. You lift your face to the wind, eyes half closed, and let the retreating clouds carry their quiet knowledge past you. The sea has settled again, rolling softly beneath a pale afternoon sky. You feel its rhythm through the soles of your feet, a pulse older than any record. Every wave carries a tone, every swell a distinct character. The Vikings assigned names to those qualities because understanding the sea's moods was a matter of survival. It was never simply water to them. It was a living force with shifting tempers, predictable habits, and occasional periods of calm. In the sagas, the sea is described as a presence that can smile or turn hostile. Calm water is said to purr like a resting animal, while stormy water snaps and strikes. That language may sound imaginative today, but it reflects something deeply functional. Recognizing those moods was not poetic indulgence, it was forecasting. A faint shimmer on the horizon could mean light, rhythmic swells that posed no threat. A green-black surface with low, rounded humps meant rising wind and genuine danger ahead. Each texture told a story. Sailors' journals from later centuries echo this same ability. They refer to whispering seas that come before calm weather and nervous seas that tremble ahead of storms. Modern meteorologists confirm that subtle vibrations do shift during pressure changes, altering the way water behaves. So when a Viking sailor said the ocean felt uneasy, he was making a precise observation expressed in poetic form. One vivid account from an Icelandic poem describes how sailors listened to the difference between rolling swells and breaking chop. Long, even waves indicated deep water. Short, chaotic bursts signaled reefs or shallows. Sometimes, when waves broke unevenly, one in three larger than the rest, they called it a hunger sea, believing it sought a sacrifice. Behind the myth was real danger, rogue waves, unpredictable and powerful. An unexpected account survives from a 10th-century voyage to the Hebrides. The crew reported that the sea hummed before it spoke. They meant that faint vibrations rose through the hull before any visible change occurred. Some scientists suggest they were detecting infrasonic frequencies produced by pressure fronts and undersea movement. Without understanding the physics, the Vikings still used this as an early warning system. You crouch and place your palm flat on the deck. The ship rocks gently, and you feel that same vibration, faint but steady, a deep murmur that never stops. No wonder they treated the sea as alive. It literally sings if you are quiet enough to hear it. They also believed that each body of water carried a mood distinct from others. The Norwegian fjords were sleepy. The North Sea sharp. The Greenland waters cruel. These descriptions came from centuries of repeated experience. When one sailor described a lazy current, everyone understood it meant slower swells but treacherous undertow. The sea's character became a shorthand for survival. Some of their expressions still survive in Scandinavian languages today. Words like brimrow, surfrot, and sigruna, sea rumble, carry echoes of those old instincts. To name something is to respect it, and naming the sea's moods gave sailors power over fear. There is a passage in one saga describing a storm where the sea turned black as ink. The crew said it consumed the light. To them, that was a sign not just of danger, but of betrayal, the ocean turning against its own travelers. Yet even then, they did not curse it. They spoke to it, promising offerings when the voyage was done. Whether that was prayer or psychology, it worked. Belief steadied trembling hands. Modern oceanographers often describe the sea as chaotic and unpredictable. But perhaps that chaos only appears unreadable because we have forgotten its language. The Vikings saw a pattern where we see noise. They could tell when a storm would pass and when it would linger. Their skill was not magic. It was attention refined into instinct. You gaze out at the horizon. The water shimmers like molten silver, calm but alert. It resembles a large animal breathing in its sleep. The ship rocks gently, the air thick with salt. Every creak of timber and sigh of rope seems part of the same living rhythm. When sailors returned home after long voyages, they often said the land felt strange beneath their feet, as though it were the sea frozen in place. Their bodies missed the motion. They had learned to match their balance to the waves so completely that stillness made them dizzy. You sense a little of that yourself now, standing on this gently rocking deck, feeling the ocean's slow pulse beneath you. The Vikings might have described this calm as the sea's smile. They knew it would not last, but for the moment it was a kind of mercy. They would rest, eat, sing softly, and thank the water for its gentleness. The sea, unpredictable as ever, listened. You close your eyes and let that rhythm move through you, the soft lift, the slow drop, the steady breathing of the ocean. It is easy to understand how sailors once spoke to it like a companion, half in fear, half in love. Perhaps that is the most honest thing they ever understood, that the sea's moods mirror our own, moving from calm to fury to forgiveness and back again. Night drifts in slowly, carrying a cool wind that smells of salt and rain. The stars begin to disappear behind gathering clouds, and the sea darkens into polished glass. The crew grows quieter, moving with practiced ease as the wind shifts. Somewhere forward, a man murmurs what sounds like a prayer. Another tosses a small coin into the water. You realize you are witnessing the boundary between science and belief, though in the Viking world, those two things were never separate. They lived in a time when observation and faith occupied the same space. To them, understanding the world meant listening both to what the senses revealed and to what the unseen might suggest. A sailor could read a current, study a shadow, and still ask the gods for guidance in the same breath. No contradiction existed between logic and reverence. Each reinforced the other. Archaeologists have uncovered small amulets aboard Viking ships, carved pieces of wood, smooth stones, and bones wrapped in cloth. These were charms for safe passage, carried not as decoration but as part of the ship's working gear. They were often placed near the mast, where wind and fate converged. In one burial site, a fragment of birch bark was found inscribed with runes that translate roughly as, "May the sea see me kindly." That single sentence holds their entire worldview, knowledge paired with reverence. An early Norse custom describes sailors carving runes into the hull before launching. The marks represented wind, fortune, or calm water. It is difficult to know whether they believed these symbols physically influenced the ocean, or whether they served as a way to focus intention. Some researchers argue the carvings functioned as psychological anchors, helping the crew confront fear with a sense of agency. Others maintain the rituals were genuine attempts to communicate with divine forces. The truth likely rests somewhere between the two. One legend tells of a helmsman who refused to sail without a small pouch of soil from his homeland tied to the stern. He said it reminded the ship where to return. Historians debate whether such stories are literal or symbolic, but the sentiment feels deeply human, a longing for connection in a world of uncertainty. Even the design of their ships reflected a blend of faith and function. The curved prows carved with dragons or serpents were not purely decorative. They were intended to frighten the spirits of storm and mist, unseen entities thought to inhabit certain seas. Yet when approaching familiar harbors, the crew often covered the carvings with cloth to avoid unsettling local land spirits. It was a form of etiquette for the invisible world. To modern observers, this may appear outdated. But to the Vikings, maintaining balance between respect and reason was essential. You glance around the deck as the wind stiffens. The men tighten ropes and check the sail's edge. Their movements are deliberate, almost ceremonial. It becomes difficult to distinguish where work ends and ritual begins. They whistle to the wind, not as a joke, but as an invitation. That sharp, clear sound is said to please Njord, the god of seafarers. The belief that whistling can summon wind still persists among sailors today. In one saga, a captain hesitates before leaving harbor because the waves growl without mouths. The crew waits until dawn, when the sea grows still, believing the water spirits have been satisfied. From a modern perspective, it simply means the tide shifted, the wind calmed, and the danger passed. Yet that willingness to treat nature as conscious may have helped them endure. If you believe the sea listens, you pay attention to every sound it makes. The rain begins, light at first, pattering softly across the deck. You notice that no one curses or complains. Instead, they speak quietly to the sky, their words somewhere between a chant and a comfort. This is what made their world so different from ours. They did not separate knowledge from reverence. To understand something deeply was to respect it. There are still questions historians debate. Some argue that the Vikings' grasp of weather patterns was purely empirical, built on direct observation. Others contend that ritual and myth played an equal role in their decision-making. Perhaps both sides are correct. In a world without instruments, intuition and imagination had to occupy the same space. The Vikings saw no need to label one approach science and the other faith. They were simply two methods of staying alive. As the night deepens, thunder murmurs in the distance, low and patient. Lightning flickers along the horizon, illuminating clouds from within. The crew slows their movements, conserving energy and trusting the rhythm they know so well. The storm is not punishment or surprise. It is part of the pattern. And somewhere in that acceptance lies the core of their wisdom. You stand still, the rain cooling your face, the ship rocking beneath your feet. The sea glows faintly with each lightning flash, revealing a silver path across the water. It feels almost sacred, as though something vast and watchful exists beyond the storm. Perhaps that is what the Vikings understood most clearly, that awe itself was a form of knowledge, a bridge between mystery and truth. The sea quiets after the storm, settling into long, gentle sighs. Mist clings to the surface like smoke, soft and silver in the early dawn. The air tastes clean again, sharp with salt and faintly sweet from seaweed. You hear a sound beneath the surface, a deep rush, like wind moving through enclosed space. The crew leans over the side, peering into the dim green world below. Then you see it, a shadow the size of the ship itself, gliding beneath the waves. A whale. To Viking sailors, whales were not merely animals. They were companions, omens, and at times, guides. The Norse word for whale carried connotations of wisdom and great age. Stories described whales leading vessels toward safe harbors or away from hidden reefs. Others warned of the Hafgufa, a creature so enormous that sailors mistook it for an island, until it sank beneath them. Some believed that when whales surfaced near calm waters, the voyage was favored. When they vanished for days, difficulty followed. Archaeological evidence reflects how deeply these creatures shaped Norse life. Carved whale bones found in coastal settlements had been fashioned into ornaments and tools. Whale oil was valued for lamps that burned more brightly than any other fuel. But the relationship extended well beyond practical use. The Vikings saw in whales something almost divine, beings that crossed between worlds, moving through the boundary of the known and the unknowable. A rare detail recorded by a later Icelandic historian describes how sailors used whale song to navigate. He wrote that experienced men could detect the hum of life beneath the surface and determine whether the animals were moving through deep or shallow water. Modern research confirms that whale calls do shift with depth and temperature, resonating differently through various ocean layers. It is entirely plausible that those early mariners observed the same patterns. Another fragment of historical record describes a voyage to Greenland where the crew followed a pod of whales for several days, trusting the animals to guide them through dense fog. When land appeared, they returned part of their catch to the sea in gratitude. Whether or not that account is fully accurate, it reflects the spirit of the age, the belief that paying attention to living things, not only to the elements, could reveal direction. Some scholars still question whether such accounts were literal or figurative. Perhaps the Vikings tracked whales because the animals fed near nutrient-rich currents that also aided navigation. Perhaps the behavior was instinct shaped by generations of careful observation. Whatever the explanation, their respect for those creatures held firm. To kill a whale without cause was considered misfortune. Even seasoned warriors, bold in every other regard, hesitated before harming something so large and clearly intelligent. You imagine the sound now, that low, resonant call that travels farther than any human voice. It moves through the ship's hull and settles in your chest. The crew listens without speaking, their faces steady, their eyes catching faint moonlight. In this moment, no one questions whether the ocean is alive. The song fades, but the stillness it leaves behind remains. There is a tale of a chieftain who claimed a white whale had spared his ship from destruction. When a sudden storm rose, The creatures surfaced alongside them, disrupting the waves and easing the water around the hull. Whether the event was real or embellished over time, the story passed into legend. Modern scientists have documented cases where whales alter surface conditions simply by moving through them. Perhaps what this man witnessed was nothing more than the physics of motion, yet that makes it no less remarkable. Later, you hear laughter as the crew exchanges fragments of old sea songs. Many of them mention whales, describing them as gods or as mountains that breathe. Some verses speak of whales carrying souls to the afterlife, gliding through stars rather than water. The image stays with you, the idea that every voyage might carry a guardian below, unseen but present. You lean against the rail again, looking into the luminous blue beneath the surface. It feels boundless, full of life. A single ripple crosses the calm, spreading outward until it dissolves into the distance. Perhaps that is how understanding travels as well, one movement through deep water, invisible but lasting. The Vikings may not have used the word science, but they understood connection. They saw themselves as part of a world where animals, humans, and forces beyond either moved within the same pattern. Every whale's breath, every wave's rise, every shift of wind belonged to the same broad rhythm. You stand quietly now, listening for another sound from below. There is none. But the silence feels dense, like the pause between heartbeats. For a moment, you sense what they must have experienced, small, yet not without meaning. Surrounded, yet never alone. The ship creaks softly. The ocean rests, and somewhere far beneath, the deep world carries stories still unspoken. The morning fog lingers like smoke, and the sea extends into gray infinity. The horizon seems to shift, neither near nor far, as though the world itself is slowly inhaling and exhaling. The crew moves carefully, their eyes narrowed against the haze. To them, this is not merely poor visibility. It is a challenge. The Vikings understood that the ocean could distort the senses, warping sight and distance into illusion. Every sailor has faced it, that disorienting moment when the boundary between water and sky dissolves entirely. The Vikings called such conditions the sea's deceit. They spoke of false horizons, of lights that appeared where no land existed, of distant vessels that disappeared when approached. Some of these were cautionary tales told to keep younger sailors watchful, but others came from genuine experience. Today, science identifies these effects as atmospheric refraction and mirage. In that earlier age, they were read as signs that the ocean was testing human perception. One well-documented phenomenon from northern waters still carries traces of that tradition, the Hillinger effect. A shimmering reflection of distant objects, produced by alternating layers of cold and warm air. Sailors might observe mountains appearing to float above the horizon, or coastlines hovering upside down in the sky. Many early explorers reported seeing entire stretches of land that later proved impossible to locate. Some historians believe that sightings of mythical lands like High Brazil or the Western Paradise may have originated from such optical illusions. A remarkable record from the 12th century describes sailors pursuing what they believed was a coastline for half a day, only to discover nothing but open ocean. Their leader, an experienced helmsman, warned them not to rely on their eyes when the air appeared to shimmer. He advised navigating by the feel of the wind instead. That decision saved their lives, as they later learned they had been drifting toward concealed rocks. His wisdom, though expressed in mythic language, reflected a sharp understanding of optical distortion. Modern atmospheric scientists have confirmed that these effects are especially common in Arctic waters, where temperature gradients bend light in unpredictable ways. What the Vikings described as the sea lying was in fact a sophisticated observation of physics they had no language to explain. They accepted that the world sometimes deceived the senses, yet rather than giving in to despair, they developed practical strategies to distinguish what was real. A notable practice arose among certain navigators. When visibility deteriorated, they would lower themselves close to the water's surface to examine the horizon. If the line appeared to rise or shimmer, they recognized it as false. If it held steady, it was safe to trust. It was a basic but effective method of verification, centuries before instruments could correct for human error. The stories built around this phenomenon are filled with both wonder and caution. One legend tells of a mirror sea where a ship could observe its own reflection sailing upside down beneath it. Another describes a ghost fleet moving in complete silence, which disappeared the moment a sailor spoke its name. These accounts may sound supernatural, but they closely mirror what scientists now call the Fata Morgana effect, a type of layered mirage that produces inverted or duplicated images over open water. Consider the tension such illusions must have created. Picture standing on deck, exhausted after days of fog, when suddenly a coastline emerges from nowhere. The crew erupts with excitement, land at last. But hours later, it remains the same distance away, or worse, dissolves into mist. Hope turns to confusion, and confusion turns to fear. For people who placed absolute trust in their senses, that betrayal of sight must have felt like the sea deliberately misleading them. Yet not all deception was perceived as harmful. Some sailors claimed that the ocean tested those it favored, offering glimpses of future voyages or distant lands not yet reached. To the dreamers and storytellers among them, the mirages were promises rather than falsehoods. Even modern psychologists might find merit in that view. The mind under stress and isolation tends to project meaning onto uncertainty. The Vikings transformed that uncertainty into narrative and, in doing so, found a way to manage it. One unusual discovery supports their keen observation. Ice cores from Greenland contained layers of volcanic ash that occasionally produced a faint glow across the North Atlantic sky. Sailors mistook this pale radiance for distant land or an otherworldly light. The error was understandable. The atmosphere itself was scattering light differently. Even their misinterpretations were a form of learning. As you watch the mist shift around the ship, shapes begin to form and dissolve. A tower, a ridge, a city built entirely from vapor. For a brief moment, you sense what they must have experienced, awe blended with caution, a reminder that the world can both guide and mislead. You blink, and the image disappears. The helmsman keeps his gaze low, steady on the waves rather than the horizon. His quiet composure feels contagious. The lesson is straightforward yet timeless. The sea may deceive, but the movement of water never does. A skilled sailor reads motion, not mirage. You take a breath, tasting the cool, damp air. The fog begins to lift. The sky brightens overhead. What remains of the illusions dissolves into clarity, and land appears far ahead, small and solid this time. The ship holds its course, unhurried, as though it always understood that patience would reveal what sight alone could not. Night settles in quietly, the sea easing into its long, steady rhythm. The crew moves like shadows across the deck, pulling cloaks around their shoulders. You hear the soft drag of rope against wood, the breath of the sail, the occasional murmur of a man drifting to sleep at his post. Life aboard a Viking ship was not defined entirely by storms and conquest. Most of it was this, waiting, listening, enduring the long stretches when nothing occurred except the continuous exchange between body and sea. The watches divided the night. One group rested while another remained awake, scanning the darkness. These shifts were called vakar, and each carried its own song or chant to mark the passage of time. Every few hours, someone whispers a change of guard, and footsteps shuffle quietly past. The rhythm never breaks. Historical evidence offers a surprisingly personal picture of life aboard these vessels. Excavations of longship remains reveal small spaces near the or benches lined with animal hides or wool blankets. Each sailor carried a personal chest that served as both storage and seat. Inside were his clothing, tools, and a few mementos, a carved comb, a lucky charm, perhaps a piece of woven cloth from home. Nothing was wasted. Everything served a purpose. The crew's meals were basic but satisfying. Dried fish, hard bread, cheese, and ale when supplies allowed. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels and closely rationed, as dehydration and saltwater exposure were constant threats. Archaeologists even recovered traces of herbs in ancient storage containers, evidence that some sailors seasoned their food simply to break the monotony. They sang to maintain rhythm during rowing, long, measured chants that carried across the waves. Some songs were purely functional, timed to each stroke of the oar. Others were part lullaby, part prayer, melodies intended to settle the sea itself. A line from an old saga reads, "The ship sleeps when the men sing." Perhaps there was truth in it. The resonance of voices, the weight of shared harmony, may genuinely have steadied the hull in rough conditions. There were superstitions for the night as well. No one whistled after dark, for fear of summoning the wind prematurely. No one sharpened a blade beneath the stars. It was believed to offend the spirits of iron. These customs kept hands occupied during daylight and still after sundown, creating a natural rhythm between rest and readiness. Think about what it meant to sleep in that environment, surrounded by uncertainty. The horizon could deliver storms, calm, or nothing at all. Sleep must have been restless, blending with constant motion. Some sailors said they dreamed of land every night but woke to endless water. Others believed that in the darkest hours, the ship drifted between worlds, the living sea above, a ghostly realm below. Modern researchers studying sleep patterns on small vessels have noted how continuous movement alters the human perception of time. You never fully enter deep rest. You remain half-conscious, always alert to change. The Vikings endured this for weeks or months at a time. Yet their accounts rarely include complaint. Fatigue was simply part of the agreement one made with the sea. One fragment tells of two sailors arguing over whose snoring sounded like thunder, keeping the entire crew awake. Their captain resolved the dispute by assigning them opposite watches so each could rest without the other's noise. You can almost hear the laughter echoing through the dark, rough voices softened by exhaustion and shared company. You walk toward the stern where the helmsman stands alone. His eyes catch faint starlight. He nods slightly but says nothing. The tiller moves in small, practiced motions, holding the course steady. Behind him, the sea stretches into darkness, vast, yet strangely calm. The sound of waves against the hull becomes hypnotic, a consistent rhythm that settles deep into your bones. There is comfort in this repetition, a pattern as dependable as a heartbeat. You begin to understand how these sailors found peace not in safety, but in routine, the daily actions that kept fear at bay. To live this way demanded faith, not in gods or stars, but in habit. Every rope tied the same way. Every tool placed exactly where it belonged. The smallest ritual became a shield against chaos. You lie back on a folded cloak, eyes half open to the sky. The ship sways gently, almost like a cradle. Somewhere nearby, someone hums an old verse, a melody that rises and falls with the movement of water. It feels less like a song and more like breathing. The world narrows to the creak of wood, the rhythm of waves, and the quiet pulse of life in the dark. You understand now why the Vikings called the sea the long road. It wasn't only about distance, but about time itself, stretched thin. Each night folded into the next, a quiet space where work, fear, and wonder blended together. Sleep was not escape. It was surrender to that rhythm. And as the ship glides on through darkness, you drift somewhere between waking and dreaming, carried forward by a heartbeat made of wind and water. Morning arrives pale and cold. The horizon sits drawn in mist. The longship rocks gently, its timbers settling after a quiet night. You feel the faint vibration of oars being shifted, the creak of leather against wood. The sea smells different now, tinged with the sweetness of distant shores. The Vikings were not only explorers or warriors. They were traders who followed the sea's natural pathways to every reachable coast. You can picture them at dawn, tightening ropes, adjusting sails, speaking in low voices about markets and merchandise. Silver from the east, silk from the south, furs from the north, amber collected from Baltic beaches. Their ships carried the primary currencies of the early Middle Ages. Yet what they exchanged most effectively was knowledge. Every voyage was a transfer of stories, languages, and skills. Archaeological findings reveal an extraordinary range of connections. Norse beads have been discovered as far away as Baghdad. Coins stamped with Arabic script have been unearthed across Sweden. The Viking trade routes functioned as cultural arteries stretching from the White Sea to the Black, from Dublin to Constantinople. Navigating such distances without maps required not only courage but a near spiritual attentiveness to the sea's behavior. An account written centuries later in the King's Mirror describes how sailors chose the right time to travel by observing bird migrations and the color of the waves. Pale green water indicated cooler currents, favorable for northward journeys. Deep blue signaled warmer flows that assisted southbound vessels. These were not guesses. They were the product of generations of careful, repeated observation. One modest discovery in a Danish burial mound illustrated trade on a small scale, a wooden box filled with peppercorns. It may seem minor, but pepper came exclusively from India during that era. The merchant who carried it had traveled, directly or indirectly, across half the known world. He likely could not name every land in between, yet he knew every harbor, every current, and every trading post that connected them. The Vikings saw no contradiction between raiding and commerce. In one season they might seize goods by force. In another, they traded those same items peacefully. Their ships made both possible. The same long, narrow hull that cut through surf in battle also moved easily up shallow rivers for trade. Because of this, they reached inland cities that few Western Europeans had ever encountered. They purchased honey in Novgorod, sold furs in Kiev, and bartered iron in the markets of Byzantium. Picture one of those harbors now. The air carries the scent of tar, spices, and smoke. Wooden stalls line the waterfront, filled with copper, glass, and wool. The crew unloads goods with practiced efficiency, stacking barrels, counting coins. They speak fragments of half a dozen languages, blending Norse with Slavic, Greek, and Arabic. To live this life was to serve as a bridge between civilizations. What historians find most remarkable is how the Vikings maintained such extensive networks without written contracts or maps. Trust, reputation, and oral record were their primary tools. A man's word carried more weight than his weapon. If a sailor deceived a partner, word spread faster than any vessel. Honor functioned as currency, and reading a person's character proved just as essential as reading the sea. One often overlooked factor in their commercial success was the Nar, their cargo ship. Unlike the long, streamlined warships, the Nar was wider and deeper, built to carry heavy loads. It moved more slowly, but offered remarkable stability. Tests using modern replicas demonstrate it could carry up to 20 tons of goods while remaining steady in rough conditions. That reliability made long-distance routes achievable and transformed the Vikings from occasional raiders into consistent global traders. You step closer to the railing, watching the crew adjust the sail. A gust of wind fills it, and the ship moves forward with quiet purpose. Somewhere ahead lies another port, another culture, another story. For a moment, the distance between continents feels smaller than the space between heartbeats. Scholars have long debated what kept driving them forward. Was it greed, curiosity, or necessity? The answer likely combined all three. In a world where farmland was scarce and winters were long, the sea was both livelihood and liberation. Yet even after wealth flowed back to their homelands, the voyages continued. Perhaps discovery had itself become the trade, a restless drive that could never quite be satisfied. You watch sunlight break through the clouds, spreading gold across the surface of the water. The sea glitters like scattered coins. That image may well have crossed their minds too, as they steered toward distant markets, profit, adventure, and wonder merging until they were impossible to separate. As evening settles, the crew gathers around a small brazier, its glow soft against their faces. Someone hums a tune learned from a merchant in far-off Miklagar, the city we now call Istanbul. The melody drifts across the deck, mixing with the scent of salt and smoke. For a moment, the ship feels less like a trading vessel and more like a moving piece of the world's fabric, threaded through every shore it has ever touched. You sit quietly, warmed by the fire, watching sparks rise into the air. The sea around you glows faintly under the fading sun. You come to understand that trade was more than the exchange of goods. It was the exchange of perspective. Each voyage extended the boundaries of what seemed possible, and in doing so, redefined the very meaning of home. The sun rises over a coastline still wrapped in mist. Behind the ship, the sea shimmers faintly, calm after so many restless nights. Ahead, the land begins to take shape, dark slopes, a strip of sand, a few distant shelters where thin columns of smoke drift into the morning sky. For the men aboard, this sight brings both relief and longing. For every sailor who left home, someone remained behind to watch the horizon. The Viking world was never only about those who sailed. It was also about those who waited. Wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters who lived along the fjords learned the language of the sea from the shore. They watched the direction of wind in the smoke rising from their hearths. They counted the days since departure and read the tides as though they were messages sent by the ocean itself. In some Icelandic sagas, women are described as keepers of weather wisdom. One fragment mentions a farmer's wife who could predict the return of ships by how clouds gathered around a mountain. She would hang clean cloths outside as a signal to the village. If the fabric stayed dry through the night, the winds favored homecoming. If it grew damp, the sea would hold her men a little longer. It might sound like folklore, but humidity and airflow around cliffs genuinely do shift before storms arrive. Archaeological digs at coastal settlements have uncovered charms and tokens left in doorways, small pieces of driftwood tied with thread, stones shaped like boats, shells arranged in circles. These were offerings not to gods of war, but to gods of waiting. They represented patience, hope, and faith in the tides. Each object held a quiet conversation with the sea. One moving account from later Norse chronicles describes a woman in Norway who kept a lamp burning in her window for every night her husband was away. Locals called it a sea eye. The flame was small, but sailors claimed they could spot it flickering even from the mouth of the fjord. Modern historians believe these lamps also served as navigation aids, though that practical function never reduced their emotional significance. Picture it now, a house built of timber and turf, the air thick with the scent of smoke and salt. Children sleep beside the fire while their mother steps outside, pulling a cloak around her shoulders. She looks out over the dark water, searching for lights that might signal an approaching vessel. The waves reflect faint stars. She listens. Somewhere far out, her husband listens too. Both of them are tuned to the same sound. Women in Norse communities also managed the economy while men were at sea. They traded goods, oversaw farms, and handled legal matters. Entire families rested on the foundation of that quiet authority. Some historians describe them as the first true maritime entrepreneurs, navigating land markets as skillfully as their husbands navigated waves. They understood the cost of weather, the value of timber, and the price of salt. Their knowledge of sea and soil kept the economy of exploration balanced. There is a legend from Greenland about a woman, said to be a priestess, who could sense when ships were nearing port. She would place her hands in a bowl of water and wait for the ripples to shift. Sailors returning home claimed her predictions were nearly always accurate. Perhaps she had learned to detect faint tremors in the air or subtle changes in wind pressure. Or perhaps her instinct was simply the result of endless waiting, attuned to patterns others had never learned to notice. The emotional weight carried by these silent watchers left a lasting mark in poetry. Old Norse verse often speaks in the voice of women dreaming of ships. They see their loved ones returning, sails spread like wings against the early light. Then the vision dissolves, and the horizon is empty once more. In those lines lives a universal ache, the understanding that love at sea must always hold hope and loss in the same hand. Modern scholars studying Viking settlements frequently note how many coastal graves contain both seafaring tools and domestic symbols. A ship's nail placed beside a spindle. A fishing weight resting next to a weaving comb. These pairings suggest that land and sea were never truly separate. Every voyage was shared, even by those who never left the shore. You stand on the deck now, the coastline slowly drawing near. Somewhere along those shores, countless women once stood where you are looking, scanning the horizon for familiar shapes. They knew how to read not just the sea, but silence itself, the kind of silence that carries both distance and devotion in equal measure. The wind shifts again, carrying the scent of heather and peat. Home feels close, though the sea still offers its final test. You understand now that navigation was never the possession of those who held the tiller alone. It also belonged to those who stayed, who waited, who spoke quietly to the waves at night. Their knowledge may not have been written into sagas, but it lived on in every returning sail. The coastline fades behind you as the longship turns once more toward open water. The air feels colder now, somehow emptier, as if the old instincts have grown still. You sense it too, the shift that began when people started trusting iron needles more than the sky. The compass arrived slowly in the north, carried through trade routes from the east, and with it came a new kind of certainty that changed everything. The Vikings never used it, but their descendants did. And with that invention, something ancient began to erode. For centuries, sailors had relied on their senses, their stories, and the shared rhythm between body and sea. Then a small magnetized needle offered direction regardless of weather or time of day. What had once been a conversation became a calculation. The compass was a remarkable achievement, yes, but it silenced part of the human exchange with the natural world. When a sailor no longer needs to listen to waves or taste the wind, the sea transforms from a partner to be respected into a problem to be solved. Historical writings from the later Middle Ages show that Nordic navigators adopted the new tool quickly. They called it the lyrestein, the guide stone, the pointer. At first it was met with doubt. Some considered it mysterious. Others worried it would offend the gods by replacing their signs. Yet convenience prevailed. Before long, sailing without it was unthinkable. The ocean, once alive with signals and meaning, became a grid of fixed directions. An old Norse proverb, recorded long after the Viking Age, states, "The man who watches only his compass forgets the wind." That simple line captures the quiet cost of progress, precision gained at the expense of connection. The Vikings, who once understood the world through touch and sound, would have found such dependence on a single instrument unsettling. They knew that even a correct bearing could fail if the sea turned against you. As navigation advanced, the language of the ocean also changed. The descriptive names given to waves, cloud formations, and color shifts faded into charts and measurements. Currents became lines on parchment. A sailor could now cross entire oceans without ever learning their moods. Knowledge became technical, reliable, certainly, but disconnected. Historians sometimes refer to this as the mechanical turn in seafaring. It made travel safer and commerce faster, but it also drew sailors away from the living world surrounding them. The generations that followed the Vikings no longer spoke of listening to whales or interpreting stars. They charted, measured, and timed. The value of uncertainty, the ongoing exchange between human and sea, faded into the background. It is easy to view this transformation as inevitable. Progress rarely waits for consent, and yet something in you mourns the loss. Standing here in the open emptiness, you recognize that certainty does not bring comfort. It brings distance. When everything can be predicted, wonder begins to disappear. Some scholars argue that the decline of instinctual navigation reflected a deeper cultural shift, from relationship to control. Where the ocean had once been a teacher, it became a territory to be managed. Ships grew larger, heavier, more assertive in their ambitions. Sailors placed their trust in instruments rather than intuition. The sea stopped feeling alive and became instead a backdrop to human goals. And yet traces of the old understanding survived. Fishermen in northern Norway still speak of listening to the sea. Inuit navigators continue to read the movement of waves beneath ice. These quiet practices are a reminder that some knowledge is not written down but carried in the body, passed between generations not through books, but through attention, patience, and time spent at the water's edge. Polynesian wayfinders guide canoes across thousands of miles by watching birds and clouds. The Viking way of knowing did not vanish entirely. It scattered like seeds caught by wind, waiting to be found again. You think about the longships now buried beneath layers of peat and sand. Their wooden frames lie silent, but the spirit of their craft lives on. Every plank was once shaped by a craftsman's instinct. Every voyage steered by courage born of careful listening. The compass may have made the ocean feel smaller, but memory keeps it vast. You look down at the water. The surface ripples gently, reflecting fragments of light. It seems to ask a quiet question. Can knowledge survive without connection? You do not answer. The sea has always been better at holding mysteries than revealing them. The ship sails on, guided by both tradition and invention. The crew checks direction by sun and shadow, then glances at a small metal needle housed inside a wooden box. It points steadily north, unwavering. But you notice how the helmsman still looks toward the sky, reading clouds, feeling wind. Perhaps he doesn't fully trust the device. Perhaps some instincts simply refuse to fade. As night falls, the stars return, faint but familiar. The same constellations that once guided the Vikings still hang above, patient and steady. They have not forgotten how to speak. It is only we who stopped listening. You raise your eyes to them and wonder what they would say if we learned to hear again. The ship moves quietly under a pale morning sun. The sea is calm, the air cool, and the wind carries only the faint sound of shifting ropes. You can almost feel the centuries turning. The world around you may have changed, but the rhythm of the ocean remains constant. What once belonged to instinct is now examined in laboratories. Modern science has begun circling back, tracing paths of ancient wisdom it once dismissed as superstition. Oceanographers have spent decades studying how humans perceive motion and space. They now understand that our brains are capable of processing subtle environmental signals far beyond conscious thought. Minor changes in wind temperature, in the quality of light, even in the pattern of echoes can trigger orientation responses. What a Viking sailor once called sea sense, or hufvilla, turns out to be measurable. It is pattern recognition refined through repetition until it feels like intuition. Recent findings in cognitive psychology support this as well. Experienced navigators show activity in areas of the brain linked not to logic but to spatial memory and emotion. They literally feel direction rather than calculate it. The early navigators were right to trust their bodies. The modern world, it seems, is only now catching up to what they already understood by instinct. There are experiments where scientists blindfold sailors and place them aboard ships under varying weather conditions. Remarkably, many can still sense orientation through subtle environmental cues, the pull of current, the rhythm of swell, even pressure in their ears. The Vikings would not have been surprised. They might have smiled at the thought that modern people needed instruments to confirm what any fisherman could tell you. The same rediscovery is unfolding in oceanography. Satellite maps now reveal invisible highways of water, currents, gyres, and drift lines that closely match Viking routes traced 1,000 years ago. The men who once followed foam and seabirds were charting the very same pathways we now study with computers. They read the living ocean. Science has finally drawn the same lines with color-coded precision. Even meteorologists now look with fresh respect at ancient methods of weather reading. Cloud halos, shifts in the scent of air, and the sudden stillness before a squall all correspond with measurable changes in atmospheric pressure. What we call meteorology, they once called memory. The sea taught them, and they listened. There is a certain irony in how progress sometimes leads us back to where we began. The Vikings crossed oceans without instruments. Centuries later, scientists equipped with satellites confirmed that their methods were remarkably accurate. All the while, the knowledge had been waiting, preserved in songs, stories, and the movements of hands tying ropes exactly as their ancestors had done. A lesser-known study from northern Norway involved fishermen who claimed to sense when land was near, even in thick fog. Researchers found they were unconsciously detecting low-frequency sound reflections from coastal cliffs, the same principle that allows bats to navigate. The human ear, it turns out, can register these echoes too, though most people have long since forgotten. The Vikings had not. Even psychology has joined this reconciliation. Scholars now argue that intuition is not irrational, but the product of accumulated experience compressed into feeling. To know something in your bones is simply to remember faster. The sea trained the mind to act without hesitation, to respond before thought. For a sailor, that was not poetry, it was survival. You stand at the ship's edge, watching waves pass in slow succession. The line where sky meets water looks timeless. Yet you know it has been measured, charted, and scanned from space. Still, the ocean feels mysterious, as if numbers can never fully capture its meaning. The more we quantify it, the more it recedes into something deeper. Perhaps that is why people keep returning to these older ways. Modern explorers study Polynesian wayfinders, Arctic hunters and northern sailors, not out of nostalgia, but in search of truth. Within their stories lies an awareness that technology can only enhance, never replace. Machines measure, but only humans interpret. You feel the wind shift against your cheek, light and cool. It carries a whisper, the same kind that must have touched the faces of sailors long before compasses, long before clocks. For a moment, you sense what they knew, that direction is not always a point on a dial, but a conversation between body, air, and memory. The ship continues forward, tracing invisible lines across an ancient surface. The instruments hum quietly. The crew monitors their readings. But you look instead to the waves. Their rhythm feels right. It feels alive. Perhaps that is what science is rediscovering, that the deepest form of understanding comes not from separating ourselves from the world, but from belonging to it completely. Evening settles softly, and the sea glows with that deep blue light that lingers long after sunset. The air is cool, nearly still, and the ship drifts more than it sails. You stand at the rail, watching the water reflect the fading sky. Each ripple carries a story, each wave a memory. For the Vikings, the sea was never merely water. It was the keeper of everything that had ever taken place upon it. They believed the ocean remembered. In the sagas, storytellers spoke of the memory of water. They said the sea could recall every ship that crossed it, every man who drowned, every oath shouted into the wind. To speak aloud on deck was to add your voice to that record. Historians once dismissed this as poetic fiction, but perhaps there is more substance to it than anyone expected. Water, after all, carries traces of everything it contacts. Modern science has shown that it stores chemical histories, recording pollution, ash, even fragments of DNA. The sea truly does remember, just not in the way people once imagined. What matters most is that the Vikings understood the power of storytelling to preserve knowledge when nothing else could. Without paper or instruments, they turned to song. Every voyage was captured in rhythm, every observation woven into verse. These chants carried the coordinates of the North Atlantic in words easy to recall yet rich with meaning. Sail when the dawn is red, one line advised. Turn when the gulls fly inland. Those phrases contained entire systems of navigation hidden inside poetry. Archaeologists studying fragments of runic carvings found near old harbors discovered short inscriptions that might have been mnemonic codes for routes. A single rune could represent a landmark or current, a compact language of survival. What began as ritual eventually became record. Even after Christianity reached the north and the old gods faded, the rhythm of preserving knowledge through voice continued. When ships returned home, their tales were performed in firelit halls. The audience would close their eyes, swaying gently to the rhythm of the recited journey. In that way, the knowledge of currents, skies, and winds passed from sailor to child, from one generation to the next. Each story strengthened the bond between people and sea, making memory the most reliable map of all. It is remarkable how much of that memory survives. In some fishing villages of northern Norway, elderly men still recite sea verses nearly unchanged from medieval forms. They describe how to find safe passage between islands, when to expect whales, and where the cold streams run strongest. The language has shifted, but the wisdom endures. These words carry a continuity that machines cannot capture, the experience of living, seeing, and feeling the sea as part of oneself. A curious detail from folklore speaks of sailors who believed that forgetting the sea's sounds would bring misfortune. Before a voyage, they would sit quietly by the shore, closing their eyes to listen. They needed to remember how the waves sounded when leaving home so they could recognize that same sound upon returning. It was a kind of auditory signature, a reminder that the ocean itself marked time through rhythm. Modern historians often compare this oral tradition to the work of later explorers who relied on written logs. Yet the two are not so different. Both are records of careful attention. One written in ink, the other carried in breath. Where we archive data, they archived feeling, the sea's moods, the scent of kelp, the tilt of the horizon. These were the coordinates of their world. You look out over the darkening water and wonder how much of that old knowledge still flows beneath it. Perhaps the ocean remembers, not in stories or runes, but in the unbroken motion that connects every tide to every shore. A wave that once struck a Viking hull might still echo faintly here, rippling outward through centuries. The thought is strangely comforting. Memory, like the sea, never truly disappears. It only changes form. What was once a song aboard a ship becomes a whisper in a museum, or a scientific theory, or a quiet moment like this. Someone standing at the edge of the world, listening to what water still knows. You close your eyes, hearing the soft rhythm beneath your feet. The ship sways gently, and for a moment it feels as though all time folds together. The old sailors, the storms, the calm mornings, the endless journeys. Their memory lives not in books or artifacts, but in motion itself. The sea has always been telling the same story. We are only learning to hear it again. The night is clear, and the sea shines faintly under the stars. The wind moves softly through the sail, making a sound like slow breathing. You stand near the bow, gazing at the open water ahead, and it feels as if time has paused. The waves rise and fall with the same rhythm they held 1,000 years ago. Every lesson, every instinct, every fragment of Viking wisdom has carried you here, to the edge where knowledge becomes reflection. What remains to understand is not new. It is what the Vikings already knew, that the sea is a teacher, and listening is its only rule. They understood that survival came from humility, not conquest. They read the ocean through every sense, aware that true understanding lived in sound, light, scent, and movement. They treated the natural world as something alive, not a possession, but a presence to be respected. In our time, we speak of data and systems, of technology that anticipates every shift in the wind. Yet the more precisely we measure, the more we lose the ability to feel. The Vikings would have recognized this contradiction. They might have said that the ocean cannot be understood through numbers alone, because it is not an object. It is a conversation. They would remind us that silence and observation are the oldest instruments available to us. Modern explorers have begun to rediscover this truth. Some researchers sail with minimal equipment, training themselves to read currents by temperature and color, to detect changes in the pitch of the wind. Others study traditional navigators from the Pacific who, like the Vikings, chart their course by waves and stars. Each discovery returns to the same conclusion. What we once called instinct is simply memory refined by patience. The Vikings lived inside that awareness. To them, the sea was a mirror of the mind, calm or turbulent, deep or still, depending on how it was approached. A reckless sailor met chaos. A patient one found guidance. They believed the sea never deceived, though it sometimes concealed its answers behind fear. That quiet, enduring conviction made them the most daring travelers of their era. You lean over the railing, listening to the hush of water against the hull. The sound is ancient and familiar. Within it, you can almost hear the echoes of their voices, the low hum of songs that steadied the oars, the soft words spoken before a storm, the laughter that followed survival. Those sounds are gone, but their rhythm persists in every tide that touches every shore. The helmsman adjusts his course slightly, hands steady on the tiller. The ship responds as though it understands. You realize that all along, the secret of their mastery was not control but harmony. They moved with the sea, not against it. They learned to trust it, to yield without losing themselves. That is what we have forgotten, and what we might yet recover. Ahead, the horizon begins to glow. Silver and gold blend in the first light of dawn. The water sparkles like a living surface. You breathe in the salt air, cool and sharp, and feel a quiet sense of gratitude. The journey has been long, but the sea never failed to offer direction. It only asked that you remain attentive. You reflect on everything the Vikings left behind, the songs, the ships, the routes across continents. Yet their greatest legacy is invisible. It lies in the way they perceived the world, not as something separate from themselves, but as something shared. They looked at the sea and saw their own reflection, fragile and powerful, lost and found within the same motion. You close your eyes for a moment, and the world narrows to sound. The waves, the wind, the slow rhythm of the ship. It is all one continuous pulse now, ancient and quiet. The journey that began with whispers of salt and night ends in stillness, where the ocean seems to listen back. Now the waves slow further, the air grows warmer. The stars soften into pale light as dawn spreads across the horizon. The ship drifts almost without sound, carried by the same current that has always moved beneath the world's surface. You let your breath follow that rhythm, slow, calm, steady. In this quiet moment, you feel the memory of everything you have heard. The calls of birds, the low song of whales, the sigh of the wind through the sail. They blend together, gentle and unending, like a lullaby older than language itself. The sea no longer feels vast or cold. It feels like home. The Vikings knew that peace was never found on land, but within the rhythm of the ocean. They trusted it, surrendered to it, and learned to rest inside its power. That same stillness is waiting here for you now. The horizon glows gently, and the water shimmers as if welcoming you back. You can release your thoughts for a while. Let your body move with the waves. Let your breathing slow until it becomes part of the tide. The world is safe here. Nothing is asking you to rush. The sea is still speaking, but now its voice has softened into a whisper meant only for sleep. The sky begins to brighten. The ship drifts forward, and the water turns to glass once more. You feel the quiet pull of gravity and the warmth of the air against your skin. The voyage is complete, yet it never truly ends. You carry that rhythm with you always, the ancient knowledge, the sound of stillness, the memory of water. Sweet dreams.